So firstly, I would point to Isaiah 51. In Isaiah 51, it links the story of Abraham and Sarah to the story of Zion. In those passages, in those verses, Zion will become the new Eden. And you can see this clearly in the verses in Isaiah 51.
I don't know what it is.
And so it's already connecting Eden imagery to the imagery of Zion. So that's how you bridge together ideas of creation and Zion, because it's actually in the language. Second of all, you would also point to other places in the prophets, like, for instance, in Ezekiel. Ezekiel couches redemption in terms of Genesis 1-3. Basically, the land shall become like Eden, as like what Isaiah is saying, and the Most High is going to take his flocks of men, and you can look at the Hebrew at this, it says flocks of Adam, and you're going to place his flocks of Adam into his new Eden. And so again, the land Zion is being connected with this idea of Eden, becoming Eden, and that's where you get ideas of new creation or recreation, however you want to phrase it. And so when it comes to the Gospels,
I'm going to Dollar Rock.
I suppose one line of thinking that you could do to connect all of this together is, on the one hand, you could point to Revelation, right? Because in you get the ideas of a new heavens and new earth in Revelation, and within that imagery, it's obviously connected to Zion, and Zion again is connected to Tree of Life imagery, so it bridges all of it together, new creation, Zion, and Eden all together. Or you could possibly point to the Gospel of John in the resurrection scene. The Messiah is mistaken for a gardener. Why is this? Is this a hint to anything? Possibly. Well, whose original job was to be a gardener, was to be Adam. And so in the Gospel of John, when the Messiah was resurrected, the context of where he's at after he's resurrected is in a garden, right? Because the tomb was in a garden. And so again, you get the idea of a garden area, just like Eden. And he's being mistaken for a gardener, right? Obviously because he's in a garden. But this would bring to mind ideas of Adam. And so basically, if the resurrection acts as a birth, and barren Zion is giving birth to the Messiah, and she was promised to become like Eden, it would make sense that you've got this imagery of Adam, or the new Adam, in a garden. And the Messiah obviously is taking the role of Adam, and the garden is a hint towards Eden. And so basically through the birth, stroke resurrection of the Messiah, Zion now has become like Eden. And within that, you've got the idea of new Adam. And so again, it links back to the idea of what you see in the prophets, how they're couching redemption in terms of Genesis 1-3, and using the imagery to say this is how things are going to work out. You'd do something like that. So the wilderness, so within the story of the prophets, you've got this overarching storyline of the Most High bringing his people out of the nations, and then they go through the wilderness journey. So it's like another Exodus. And their ultimate destination is to Zion. And so within the gospel accounts, you do have this wilderness imagery that's being conveyed because of the usage of passages like Isaiah 40 in the Synoptic Gospels, and also technically in the Gospel of John. And so John the Baptist comes preaching, and you've got the wilderness imagery right there. And he's preparing the way. And obviously in the prophets, if they're going on a journey, there's a way that they go. And you can see this in passages like Isaiah 35, for instance, where it speaks specifically about this way in the wilderness. But there's other places and other passages that speak of this as well, like in Jeremiah, for instance. And so it's giving that sense of we are now beginning this journey. Our ultimate destination is to Zion, but this is all part of the redemptive process, and this is the new Exodus that's coming up. And if you think about this in terms of the Messiah and when he was crucified, obviously um, it comes to pass on a Passover. So Passover gives you the imagery of an Exodus imagery, and so this ties together with ideas of Passover, new Exodus, and this ties in with the prophets and how the Messiah is going to bring his people through the wilderness back into promised land, a restored Eden, a restored Zion. So you'd say something like that, or probably better.
Did forgive me if I've forgotten already in this short span, but did you speak about the barren woman and the dry land and how they kind of become more alive?
Yeah, I mean, in the prophet Isaiah, there is promises that the wilderness will become fertile. But this also ties into the idea of fertility being linked to Zion, right? Because if you read Isaiah 51, and I think if you read Isaiah 51, it's going to be a key passage because it's going to bridge a lot of these ideas together. And so, what's the reason why Zion is barren? The reason why Zion is barren is because the nations have come in as a form of judgment and taken her children away or slayed them. And now she's imaged as this barren, grieving woman. And so some of the prophecies are directed specifically towards this idea of barrenness, that she will no longer be barren. And you can see that in places like in Isaiah 54, for instance, where you have these promises that she'll no longer be barren. And of course, this ties in with the imagery that you see with Sarah and Abraham, right? Because Sarah was barren, and the Most High overcomes the idea of infertility to make her fertile and therefore have children. And this ties in with the imagery that you see with Zion. She is barren, but the Most High is going to overcome the idea of barrenness. And it's using this wilderness language that you see with Zion to indicate this barrenness. Because in Hebrew, earth is feminine. And so the land is conceptualized as a woman. And so within that, you have this imagery of womb and other imagery associated with the feminine. And so there has to be a resolution to this barrenness. And that resolution culminates in the gospel in terms of resurrection.
With Jesus going into the barren land and then resurrecting.
Yeah. So like, but when you like read like passages in like Romans chapter 4, and the Apostle Paul's talking about Sarah and the deadness of her womb, right? Why is he concentrating on the deadness of her womb? And he basically makes a comparison between Isaac and the Messiah, because Isaac would have been placed in a barren womb and out he would have come, and the Messiah also, because he was placed into the ground, he was placed into the barren womb of Zion, and when he comes out, it's like a birth. And again, you've got this overarching imagery of bringing a child out, or bringing something out of that which is barren.
Kind of wants me to talk about Abraham and altars now, but that's a different topic.